The bullet grazed Everett Thompson's shoulder as she dove behind the overturned stagecoach, her heart hammering against her ribs while dust kicked up around her boots in the hot Utah sun. The outlaws had come out of nowhere on the road between Cedar City and St. George, their guns blazing before the driver even had time to reach for his rifle. Now he lay motionless in the dirt, and Everett was alone with three men who clearly had no intention of just taking the strongbox and riding away. She pressed her back against the splintered wood, her father's derringer clutched in trembling hands, knowing she had maybe 2 shots before they closed in. The sound of boots crunching on gravel grew closer, and she squeezed her eyes shut, whispering a prayer she wasn't sure anyone would hear. Then came the thunder of hooves and a sharp crack of gunfire from a different direction. Everett's eyes flew open as she heard shouting, the outlaws cursing and returning fire at this new threat. She risked a glance around the edge of the coach and saw a lone rider, tall in the saddle, his hat pulled low as he charged straight into the fray with a rifle in one hand and reins in the other. His horse was a magnificent chestnut that moved like it could read his mind, wheeling and turning while he fired with precision that spoke of years in the saddle. Within moments, 2 of the outlaws were clutching wounds and the third was galloping away into the desert, leaving his companions groaning in the dirt. The rider dismounted in one fluid motion and approached slowly, his rifle still ready but pointed down. As he came closer, Everett could see his face beneath the brim of his hat. He was young, maybe 25 or 26, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of summer grass that held both wariness and concern. A strong jaw was shadowed with a few days of stubble, and dust coated his dark hair and the shoulders of his worn leather vest. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had spent more time under open sky than under any roof. "Madam, are you hurt?" His voice was deep and steady, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the violence he just delivered. Everett realized she was still holding the derringer pointed in his general direction and quickly lowered it. "I'm fine. Thank you. You saved my life." She tried to stand, but her legs were shaking so badly she nearly fell. He was there in an instant, catching her elbow with a gentle grip. "Easy now. The fear catches up after the danger passes. Just breathe." He helped her to a spot where she could sit on a relatively intact section of the coach's side. "My name's Garrett Easton. I was riding from my ranch outside town when I heard the shooting." "Everett Thompson," she managed, finally getting her breathing under control. "I was coming to St. George to stay with my aunt. My parents passed last winter in Boston, and she's the only family I have left." Garrett's expression softened with sympathy. "I'm real sorry for your loss, Miss Thompson. St. George is still a few hours' ride from here." "These men," he gestured to the wounded outlaws who were now sitting with their hands up, clearly deciding cooperation was their best chance at survival. "They part of the Dalton crew that's been troubling these parts lately." "The driver," Everett said suddenly, remembering. "Is he?" Garrett walked over to check and shook his head grimly. "I'm afraid so, madam. He went quick, if that's any consolation." It wasn't, but Everett nodded anyway. She'd only met the driver that morning, but he'd been kind to her, helping her with her trunk and making pleasant conversation about the scenery. Now he was gone, leaving behind a wife and children he'd mentioned with such obvious pride. The injustice of it made her chest tight with anger and sorrow. Garrett tied up the 2 wounded outlaws with practiced efficiency, then loaded the driver's body onto one of their horses with surprising gentleness. "We'll take him into St. George for a proper burial. You can ride with me if you're comfortable with that. My horse can handle 2 for the distance we need to cover, and we can tie your belongings to the other horse." Everett looked at this stranger, who had appeared like something out of a dime novel, and found herself trusting him completely. Maybe it was the sincerity in those green eyes, or the respectful distance he maintained while still being helpful. "That would be very kind of you, Mr. Easton." "Just Garrett, please. Mr. Easton was my father, and I'm nowhere near respectable enough to carry his title yet." There was a hint of humor in his voice, and Everett found herself almost smiling despite everything that had just happened. He helped her retrieve her trunk from the coach, refusing to let her carry anything heavy despite her protests that she was perfectly capable. As he secured her belongings, she studied him more carefully. His clothes were well worn but clean, his boots scuffed but well made. The rifle he carried was old but meticulously maintained, and the same could be said of his saddle and tack. This was a man who took care of what he had, who valued quality and durability over flash. When everything was secured, Garrett mounted his horse first, then extended a hand down to Everett. She placed her hand in his and felt the callous strength there as he pulled her up behind him with seemingly no effort at all. She settled onto the horse's back, suddenly very aware of how close she was to this man, how she would need to hold onto him to stay secure. "You'll want to put your arms around my waist," Garrett said quietly, as if reading her hesitation. "I'll keep us at a steady pace, but the terrain can be rough." Everett did as instructed, circling her arms around his solid middle and trying not to think about how intimate the position felt. She could feel the warmth of him even through his shirt and vest, could smell leather and sage and something uniquely him. As they started moving, she found herself relaxing against his back, the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the security of his presence easing the terror that still lurked at the edges of her mind. They rode in silence for a while, the desert landscape rolling past in shades of red and gold under the late afternoon sun. The heat was intense, but there was a stark beauty to this country that Everett hadn't expected. Having grown up in Boston with its brick buildings and cobblestone streets, the vast openness of Utah territory was both intimidating and exhilarating. "First time out west?" Garrett asked after a while, his voice carrying easily despite the sound of the horse's hooves. "That obvious?" Everett replied, "You keep looking around like you can't quite believe what you're seeing. I remember that feeling. I came out here from Missouri when I was 17, and I thought I'd landed on another planet entirely." "What brought you here?" She felt him shift slightly in the saddle. "Needed a fresh start. My father and I didn't see eye to eye on much, and after my mother passed, there wasn't anything keeping me there. I worked cattle drives for a few years, saved every penny, and finally bought a small spread about 3 years ago. It's not much, but it's mine." There was pride in his voice, the kind that came from earning something through hard work rather than inheriting it. Everett understood that feeling. Her father had been a shopkeeper, respected but never wealthy, and everything she had came from years of her parents' careful saving and sacrifice. "What about you?" Garrett continued. "What are you planning to do in St. George?" "I'm not entirely sure," Everett admitted. "My aunt runs a boarding house. She wrote that I could help her with that, but honestly, I think she offered more out of obligation than need. I have some education. I was working as a teacher in Boston, but the school was connected to my father's church, and after he died, the position went to someone else. Can you read and write well, of course, and I can do figures, keep accounts, that sort of thing. Then you'll find work if you want it. St. George is growing fast. The Mormon settlers have been building it up for about 20 years now, and more people arrive every month. A woman with education is valuable anywhere, but especially in a young town." They crested a rise, and suddenly St. George spread out before them in the valley below. The Virgin River cut through the landscape, and neat rows of buildings lined orderly streets. Fields of cotton and fruit trees created green patches against the red earth. It was smaller than Everett had imagined, but more established than she'd feared. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It grows on you," Garrett agreed. "The heat takes some getting used to. Summer here can reach 110 degrees, which is why some folks call it Utah's Dixie. But the winters are mild, and if you can handle the intensity of it, there's nowhere else quite like it." They made their way down into town. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the red rocks in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost unreal, people on the street stopped to stare at their unusual procession, a cowboy with a young woman riding behind him, leading horses carrying both a body and 2 wounded outlaws. Garrett guided them straight to the sheriff's office, a sturdy adobe building near the center of town. A man with a silver star on his vest emerged before they'd even dismounted, his weathered face creased with concern. "Garrett, what happened?" "Dalton gang hit the Cedar City stage, Sheriff Montgomery. Drivers dead, and these 2 were part of it. The 3rd got away heading east. The lady is Miss Everett Thompson. She was the only passenger and she's unharmed, but she'll need to give a statement." The sheriff helped Everett down from the horse while Garrett dismounted and began untying the outlaws. "Miss Thompson, I'm real sorry this happened to you. We've been trying to track that gang for months now. You're very lucky Garrett came along when he did." "I'm aware," Everett said, finding her legs were steadier now. "He was incredibly brave." Garrett looked uncomfortable with the praise, focusing intently on securing the outlaws. The sheriff called for his deputy, and soon the wounded men were being hauled inside while another man went to fetch the doctor to tend their wounds before they were locked up properly. Giving her statement took longer than Everett expected. The sheriff was thorough, wanting every detail she could remember about the attack. Garrett sat quietly nearby, adding his own account when asked. By the time they were finished, full darkness had fallen and Everett realized she had no idea where her aunt's boarding house even was. "I can take you to Mrs. Henderson's place," Garrett offered, seeming to sense her uncertainty. "That's your aunt, correct?" "Yes, Helen Henderson. You know her." "Everyone knows everyone in St. George, Miss Thompson. It's that kind of town. Mrs. Henderson runs a good establishment on Tabernacle Street. Very respectable." They collected Everett's trunk, which Garrett insisted on carrying, and walked through the quiet streets. Lamps glowed in windows, and the smell of cooking fires and evening meals drifted on the air. A few people called greetings to Garrett, and he responded with friendly waves, never breaking stride. The boarding house was a 2-story structure painted white with a wide front porch. Before they reached the steps, the door flew open and a plump woman with graying hair rushed out. "Everett." "Oh, my dear child, we heard there was trouble with the stage. I've been beside myself with worry." Aunt Helen gathered Everett into a crushing embrace, and suddenly the events of the day overwhelmed her. She found herself crying against her aunt's shoulder while the older woman made soothing sounds and stroked her hair. When the storm passed, Everett pulled back, embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to fall apart like that." "Nonsense. You've had a terrible shock. Come inside, I'll make tea." Aunt Helen finally seemed to notice Garrett standing a respectful distance away with the trunk. "And you must be the young man who saved her. Please, come in. It's the least I can do to offer you a meal." "That's not necessary, madam," Garrett said. "I was just doing what anyone would do." "But you're the one who actually did it, so come inside before I have to get forceful." Despite her words, Aunt Helen's tone was warm and grateful. Garrett glanced at Everett, who found herself hoping he would accept. She wasn't ready to say goodbye to him yet, though she couldn't quite explain why. He must have seen something in her expression because he nodded. "Just for a short while then. Thank you for your hospitality." The interior of the boarding house was neat and welcoming, with comfortable furniture and the lingering scent of fresh bread. Aunt Helen led them to a dining room where a long table could seat a dozen people, though it was empty now. She bustled off to the kitchen, calling back that she'd return shortly with food. Everett and Garrett sat across from each other, and in the lamplight, she could see him properly for the first time. He was even more handsome than she'd realized, with strong features and those remarkable green eyes that seemed to notice everything. But it was the kindness in his face that struck her most, a gentleness that hadn't been diminished by whatever hardships had brought him west. "You didn't have to stay," Everett said quietly. "I know you probably have things to get back to. Nothing that can't wait until morning. My ranch hand is watching things, and it's not so big an operation that one evening away will cause trouble." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I wanted to make sure you were settled safely. After what you went through today, the least I can do is see you properly delivered to your family. You did much more than that. You saved my life, Garrett. I don't know how I can ever thank you properly." He looked uncomfortable again, shifting in his chair. "You don't owe me thanks, Miss Thompson. I just did what was right. Please call me Everett. After I spent several hours holding on to you for dear life on horseback, I think we're past formalities." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Everett it is, then. That's an unusual name for a woman, if you don't mind me saying. It was my mother's maiden name. My parents had hoped for a son to carry it on, but after I was born, my mother couldn't have more children, so they gave it to me instead. I used to hate it growing up, always having to explain it to people, but now I'm glad to carry a piece of her with me." "It suits you," Garrett said, and something in the way he said it made Everett's heart skip. Aunt Helen returned with a tray laden with cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, and pickles. She poured tea for Everett and coffee for Garrett without asking, somehow knowing instinctively what each of them needed. As they ate, she asked gentle questions about what had happened, and Garrett provided most of the details, sparing Everett from having to relive it all again so soon. "You're a blessing, Mr. Easton," Aunt Helen declared when the tale was told. "Everett could have been killed or worse. That gang has been terrorizing this area for too long. Hopefully, with two of them in custody, the sheriff will have an easier time tracking down the rest," Garrett replied. "They tend to fall apart once you start picking them off one by one." They talked for a while longer, and Everett learned that Garrett's ranch was about 5 miles outside town, that he raised horses primarily with some cattle, and that he did most of the work himself with just one hired man to help. It was clear he worked hard, and from the respectful way Aunt Helen spoke to him, he was well regarded in the community. Finally, Garrett stood, saying he really did need to get back. Aunt Helen showed him to the door with many thanks and an open invitation to Sunday dinner, which he accepted with surprising speed. When her aunt went to check on something in the kitchen, Everett found herself alone with Garrett on the front porch. "Will you be all right?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. "I think so. Today was terrifying, but I'm safe now thanks to you." She hesitated, then added, "Will I see you again? Before Sunday, I mean. Would you like to?" The directness of the question caught her off guard, but she met his gaze steadily. "Yes, I would." His smile was slow and genuine, transforming his serious face into something that made her breath catch. "Then I'll come by tomorrow afternoon if that's acceptable. I need to come into town for supplies anyway, and maybe I could show you around St. George properly. Help you get your bearings. I'd like that very much." He tipped his hat to her, a gesture that was somehow both old-fashioned and charming. "Until tomorrow, then, Everett, sleep well." She watched him walk away into the darkness, his tall form eventually disappearing around a corner. Only then did she go inside, where she found her aunt watching her with knowing eyes. "He's a good man," Aunt Helen said simply. "Not many like him around these days." "I just met him," Everett protested, but she could feel warmth in her cheeks. "Sometimes that's all it takes. Your uncle and I knew within a day of meeting that we'd marry. When it's right, it's right." She patted Everett's hand. "Now come on, let me show you to your room. You must be exhausted." The room was small but comfortable, with a window overlooking the street and a bed that looked impossibly inviting. Aunt Helen had already unpacked her trunk, hanging her few dresses in the wardrobe and placing her personal items on the dresser. The kindness of it brought fresh tears to Everett's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, hugging her aunt tightly, "for everything, for taking me in, for making me feel welcome. Your family, dear, this is your home now for as long as you want it." Aunt Helen kissed her forehead. "Tomorrow things will look brighter. They always do." After her aunt left, Everett changed into her nightgown and crawled into bed, expecting to lie awake replaying the day's events. Instead, she fell asleep almost immediately, her last conscious thought of green eyes and a gentle smile. She woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the sound of activity from downstairs. For a moment, she was disoriented, not recognizing her surroundings. Then memory flooded back the attack, Garrett's rescue, arriving in St. George. She rose and dressed in one of her simpler day dresses, a blue calico that had seen better days but was still respectable. Downstairs, she found the dining room filled with boarders eating breakfast. Aunt Helen introduced her to everyone, a pair of surveyors working on extending the railroad, a widow who worked as a seamstress, a young couple newly arrived from Nevada, and an older gentleman who taught at the local school. Everyone was friendly and welcoming, though she could see the curiosity in their eyes. News of yesterday's attack had clearly spread. After breakfast, Aunt Helen put her to work immediately, and Everett was grateful for the distraction. They changed linens, scrubbed floors, prepared food for the midday meal, and mended torn items. It was hard physical work, different from teaching, but there was something satisfying about it. Her aunt kept up a steady stream of conversation, filling Everett in on the town's history and inhabitants. St. George had been founded by Mormon pioneers, sent by Brigham Young to establish a cotton mission in the warmer southern climate. The work had been brutal at first, the summers almost unbearable, but the settlers had persevered. Now the town was thriving, with a magnificent tabernacle under construction, productive farms, and a growing population. The people were mostly Mormon, Aunt Helen explained, but they welcomed outsiders as long as they were respectful and willing to work hard. "Are you Mormon?" Everett asked her aunt. "No, dear. Your uncle wasn't and I never converted, but I respect their ways and they respect mine. That's how we get along out here. You left the religious divisions and prejudices back east if you want to survive." She paused in her work. "Speaking of which, that young man who rescued you, Garrett, he's not Mormon either. Doesn't hold with any organized religion from what I understand, though he's a good man regardless. Just thought you should know in case that matters to you." "It doesn't," Everett said, surprising herself with how quickly she responded. "My father was a minister, but I've always thought that what matters is how people act, not what they profess to believe." Aunt Helen nodded approvingly. "You'll do fine here, Everett. You have the right attitude for frontier life." The afternoon seemed to take forever to arrive. Everett changed into her better dress, a gray one with small purple flowers, and tidied her dark blonde hair into a neat arrangement. She told herself she wasn't primping for Garrett, but when she caught her aunt's amused expression, she knew she wasn't fooling anyone. He arrived exactly when he said he would, riding up to the boarding house on his beautiful chestnut horse, now accompanied by a wagon. He'd cleaned up too, she noticed, wearing what was probably his best shirt and with his hair still damp from washing. "I thought the wagon might be more comfortable for a tour of town," he explained as he helped her up onto the seat beside him. "And more respectable than having you ride double again." They spent the next 2 hours driving around St. George while Garrett pointed out landmarks and businesses. He showed her the Tabernacle under construction, an impressive building that would seat hundreds when completed. They passed the schoolhouse, smaller cotton factories, various shops, and the farms that surrounded the town. Garrett seemed to know everyone they passed, calling greetings and introducing Everett so many times she knew she'd never remember all the names. What struck her most was how Garrett spoke about the town and its people. There was genuine affection in his voice, respect for what they'd built here in such an unforgiving landscape. He pointed out irrigation ditches that had been dug by hand, fields that had been cleared of rocks one stone at a time, buildings that had been raised by community effort when individual families lacked resources. "Everyone helps everyone here," he explained. "Has to be that way. The desert doesn't care about your religion or where you came from or what you did before. It'll kill you just the same if you're not careful, so we watch out for each other." "Is that why you helped me yesterday? Because that's just what people do here." He was quiet for a moment, guiding the horses around a rough patch in the road. "That was part of it, but also because when I saw that overturned stage and heard the shooting, I thought about how I'd feel if someone I cared about was in danger and nobody came to help. Couldn't live with myself if I'd ridden past. Does that happen often? You rushing in to save people?" He gave her a sidelong glance, and she saw humor in his eyes. "Not as often as you might think. Yesterday was actually the most exciting thing that's happened to me in about 2 years." "What happened 2 years ago?" "Got thrown from a half-broken Mustang and landed in a patch of prickly pear cactus. Spent a week pulling out spines. My ranch hand still brings it up whenever he wants to make me feel foolish." Everett laughed, the sound surprising her. After everything that had happened, she hadn't expected to feel light enough for laughter so soon. But Garrett had that effect on her, making her feel safe and comfortable in a way she couldn't quite explain. They stopped at the general store so Garrett could pick up his supplies, and he insisted on buying Everett a peppermint stick, despite her protests. As they walked back to the wagon with his purchases, they nearly collided with a well-dressed man in his 40s who was emerging from the building. "Easton," the man said with a slight sneer. "Still scratching out a living on that pathetic excuse for a ranch." Garrett's expression didn't change, but Everett felt him tense beside her. "Still doing fine, Mr. Sutton. Miss Thompson, this is Douglas Sutton. He owns the largest ranch in the area." Mr. Sutton, Miss Everett Thompson, newly arrived from Boston. Sutton's eyes raked over Everett in a way that made her skin crawl. "Boston? A cultured lady? Whatever are you doing wasting time with a dirt-poor horse trader, my dear? A woman of quality should have better prospects." Before Everett could respond, Garrett said evenly, "Miss Thompson is free to spend her time however she chooses. Now if you'll excuse us." He guided Everett around Sutton and helped her up into the wagon. As they drove away, Everett asked, "Who was that unpleasant man?" "Douglas Sutton. He owns about 10,000 acres and thinks that makes him king of southern Utah. He's been trying to buy my land for 3 years now, but I won't sell. The fact that I'm succeeding without his help or approval bothers him something fierce." "Why does he want your land so badly?" "There's a spring-fed creek that runs through my property. Water's precious out here, and whoever controls it has power. My creek feeds into his land, but I could divert it or dam it if I wanted to. I won't, because that's not how I operate, but the fact that I could drives him crazy. He seems like a bully." That's because he is one. But don't worry about Douglas Sutton. His bark is worse than his bite, and most folks in town see right through him. They continued their tour, and Garrett's good humor quickly returned. He took her to a spot just outside town where the view stretched for miles, red rock formations rising like ancient sentinels against the blue sky. They sat in the wagon watching the shadows lengthen as the sun moved westward. "What do you think of St. George so far?" Garrett asked. "It's different from anything I've known, but I think I could grow to love it here. There's a freedom to it, isn't there? All this space, the way people seem less concerned with social propriety and more with practical things. That's one of the things I love most about the West. You can reinvent yourself out here. Nobody much cares who your family was or what mistakes you made before you arrived. What matters is who you are right now and whether you're willing to work." "Is that what you did? Reinvent yourself?" He nodded slowly. "In a way. Back in Missouri, I was supposed to follow my father into business. He had a dry goods store and plans for me to expand it, maybe start a whole chain. But I couldn't breathe there, couldn't stand the idea of spending my life indoors tallying accounts and worrying about profit margins. I wanted to work with my hands to build something real. He called me a fool and worse when I left." "You regret it?" "Not for a second. I miss my mother sometimes, wish I could have said goodbye properly before she passed. But this life, my ranch, the work I do, it's who I'm meant to be." He turned to look at her. "What about you? Any regrets about coming west?" "Ask me again in a month," Everett said with a smile. "Right now I'm still too overwhelmed to have proper perspective." "Fair enough." He checked the position of the sun. "I should get you back before your aunt starts to worry, and I need to get home before dark." On the drive back to the boarding house, they talked about smaller things, her teaching experience, his process for breaking and training horses, the kinds of books they'd read, whether winter or summer was more challenging in their respective climates. The conversation flowed easily, naturally, and Everett realized she'd never felt this comfortable with a man before. The few suitors she'd had in Boston had always made her feel like she needed to be someone different, someone more refined or quieter or more agreeable. With Garrett, she could just be herself. When they arrived at the boarding house, he helped her down from the wagon and they stood there for a moment, neither quite ready to part ways. "Thank you for showing me around," Everett said. "It helped me feel less like a stranger here." "My pleasure." "I was wondering," he hesitated, looking almost nervous. "There's a dance Saturday evening at the community hall. Would you consider letting me escort you?" Everett's heart leaped. "I'd love that." His smile was brilliant. "Good, that's real good. I'll pick you up at 7. 7 is perfect." He lingered a moment longer, then tipped his hat and climbed back into his wagon. Everett watched him drive away, already counting the hours until Saturday. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Everett settled into the rhythm of the boarding house, learning her aunt's routines and getting to know the regular boarders. The school teacher, Mr. Patterson, heard about her teaching background and asked if she'd consider helping him. The town's population had grown faster than expected, and he was overwhelmed trying to teach children ranging from 6 to 16 all in one room. Everett agreed immediately, grateful for the opportunity to do work she loved. She started the very next day, taking charge of the younger children while Mr. Patterson focused on the older students. The children were a mix of backgrounds: Mormon settlers' kids, children of miners and ranchers, a few Native American children from the nearby Paiute community. Everett treated them all the same, with patience and respect, and they responded with enthusiasm that warmed her heart. Word of the new teacher spread quickly, and parents began stopping by to thank her. It seemed St. George had been in need of additional educational help for some time. Mr. Patterson was a good teacher, but getting on in years, and the physical demands of managing so many children of different ages and abilities was wearing him down. "You're a natural," he told Everett on her third day. "The children respond to you wonderfully. If you're interested, I'd like to recommend to the town council that we make your position official. It wouldn't pay much, but it would be steady work." "I'd be honored," Everett replied, meaning it. Having her own income, even modest, meant independence and security. It meant not being a burden on her aunt. No matter how welcoming Aunt Helen had been, on Saturday, Everett spent extra time getting ready for the dance. She wore her best dress, a deep green that brought out her eyes, and Aunt Helen helped her pin up her hair with small flowers tucked into the arrangement. When Garrett arrived, the look on his face told her the effort had been worth it. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. "You clean up pretty well yourself," she replied, taking in his pressed shirt and vest, his freshly shaved face, and the careful way he'd combed his hair. The community hall was already crowded when they arrived, filled with families and young people eager for entertainment. A small group of musicians was setting up in one corner, a fiddle player, someone with a guitar, and a woman at a piano that looked like it had seen better days but was lovingly maintained. Garrett introduced Everett to more people, and she was struck by how many folks seemed genuinely happy to meet her. Several of the mothers whose children she'd been teaching made a point of expressing their gratitude. The attention was a bit overwhelming but also touching. When the music started, Garrett offered his hand. "May I have this dance?" Everett placed her hand in his, and he led her onto the floor. He was a surprisingly good dancer, leading her through the patterns with confidence. His hand on her waist was warm and steady, and being this close to him made her pulse race. "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked as they moved together. "My mother insisted. Said that no matter what kind of work a man did, he should know how to properly escort a lady in polite company. She made me practice with her every Sunday afternoon for years. She sounds like a wonderful woman." "She was. You would have liked her, I think. She had your same way of seeing the good in people, of believing the best about them until they proved otherwise." They danced several more times, and Everett couldn't remember ever enjoying an evening more. Between dances, Garrett introduced her to his ranch hand, a leathery man named Pete who was at least 60 and treated Garrett like a son. Pete regaled her with embarrassing stories about Garrett's early attempts at ranching, including the infamous cactus incident, while Garrett groaned good-naturedly. "Don't listen to him," Garrett protested. "He makes everything sound much worse than it actually was." "Can't make something worse when it was already about as bad as it could get," Pete replied with a grin. "You should have seen him, Miss Thompson. Looked like a porcupine had gotten into a fight with a tomato." Everett laughed until her sides hurt, and Garrett's expression of mock offense only made it funnier. The evening was nearly over when Douglas Sutton approached them. He'd clearly been drinking, his face flushed and his movements less coordinated than earlier. "Miss Thompson," he said, ignoring Garrett entirely, "I believe you owe me a dance. Can't have you spending the whole evening with hired help when a gentleman is available." "Mr. Sutton, I'm here with Garrett," Everett said firmly, "and I don't owe anyone anything." "Come now, don't be difficult. Surely you can see that associating with a nobody like Easton won't do your reputation any good." He reached for her arm, and Garrett stepped between them smoothly. The lady said no. "I suggest you respect that and move along." Sutton's face darkened. "You forget yourself, Easton. I could buy and sell you 10 times over. Maybe so, but money doesn't buy manners or decency as you keep demonstrating." Garrett's voice was level, but there was steel underneath. "Go home, Sutton. Sleep it off." For a moment, Everett thought Sutton might actually try to fight, but then the sheriff appeared at his elbow. "Everything all right here, gentlemen?" "Just fine, Sheriff," Garrett said. "Mr. Sutton was just leaving." The sheriff looked at Sutton. "That right, Douglas?" Sutton glared at all of them but finally turned and stalked out of the hall. The sheriff nodded to Garrett and Everett before melting back into the crowd. "I'm sorry about that," Garrett said quietly. "He gets mean when he drinks. That wasn't your fault. Although I'm beginning to understand why you don't care for the man. He's not worth thinking about. Come on, they're playing one last song." "Dance with me," she did, and as they moved together, Everett felt something shift inside her. This man, this kind, strong, honest man, was becoming important to her in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. She'd known him less than a week, but already she couldn't imagine her life without him in it. When Garrett took her home that night, they stood on the porch of the boarding house, neither quite ready to say good night. "I had a wonderful time," Everett said softly. "So did I. Everett, I know we haven't known each other long, but I'd like to keep seeing you if you're agreeable to that." "I am, very much so." He smiled, and in the moonlight his eyes were dark and warm. "Good, that's real good. I'll come by tomorrow after church if that's all right. Maybe we could go for a ride, see more of the countryside." "I'd like that." He lifted her hand and kissed it gently, a gesture that was both old-fashioned and achingly romantic. "Good night, Everett." "Good night, Garrett." She went inside feeling like she was floating and found her aunt waiting up with knowing eyes and a warm smile. The next weeks fell into a pattern that made Everett happier than she'd been in years. During the week, she taught the younger children at the school, finding deep satisfaction in watching them learn and grow. The town council officially hired her with a small salary, and she opened her own account at the local bank, taking pride in her independence. Evenings were spent at the boarding house, helping her aunt and getting to know the other residents better. She discovered she enjoyed the communal nature of the place, the way people looked out for each other and shared their lives in small ways. And then there were the times with Garrett. He came to town several times a week, always finding an excuse to stop by. Sometimes they went for rides, exploring the stunning landscape around St. George. He showed her hidden canyons and ancient petroglyphs left by people who'd lived here long before the Mormon settlers arrived. They found a spot by his creek where the water pooled deep and clear, and she listened while he described his plans for the ranch, his dreams of breeding horses that would be known throughout the territory for their quality. Other times they simply walked through town or sat on the boarding house porch talking until the stars came out. Garrett told her about his childhood in Missouri, his difficult relationship with his father, and how finding his place in the West had saved him in ways he was still discovering. Everett shared her own stories growing up as an only child, watching her parents struggle financially while maintaining their dignity, the loneliness of being different in a place that valued conformity. "You're not different," Garrett said one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the cliffs in shades of red and gold. "You're just yourself, and that's exactly who you should be." It was such a simple statement, but it meant more to Everett than any elaborate compliment could have. With Garrett, she never felt like she needed to pretend or perform. She could just exist, and that was enough. 6 weeks after she'd arrived in St. George, Garrett invited her to visit his ranch. They rode out on a Sunday afternoon, Everett on a gentle mare that Garrett had trained himself. His ranch was modest but well-maintained, with a sturdy house he'd built with his own hands, a barn, and several corrals where horses watched them approach with curiosity. Pete was there to greet them, giving Everett a nod of approval that made her feel like she'd passed some kind of test. He made himself scarce after that, giving them privacy as Garrett showed her around. The house was simple 2 rooms downstairs and a sleeping loft above. But it was clean and well organized, with handmade furniture that showed real craftsmanship. Books lined one wall, and Everett moved closer to examine the titles. There was Shakespeare and Dickens, volumes on horse husbandry and animal medicine, and several books of poetry that surprised her. "Didn't take you for a poetry reader," she said, pulling out a worn copy of Whitman. "My mother's influence again. She believed that working with your hands didn't mean you should neglect your mind." He moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "Do you like poetry? Some of it. Whitman especially. There's something about his celebration of ordinary life that speaks to me." Garrett reached past her to pull the book from the shelf, and his arm brushed hers, sending a shiver through her. He opened to a marked page and read aloud, his voice soft but clear. "I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you." He closed the book and set it aside, then turned to face her fully. "Everett, I need to tell you something." Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "What is it?" "I'm in love with you. I know it's soon, and maybe I'm being a fool, but I can't keep it to myself anymore. You've become the best part of every day. When I'm working, I think about what I'll tell you about it later. When something happens, you're the first person I want to share it with. I never believed in this kind of feeling before, thought it was something people made up in stories, but you've shown me different." Everett felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. "I love you too. I didn't expect to, didn't think I'd come west and find the one person who makes me feel completely myself. But here you are, and I don't want to be anywhere you're not." Garrett cupped her face gently in his calloused hands. "May I kiss you?" "Yes," she whispered, and then his lips were on hers, tender and sweet and perfect. She melted into him, her hands gripping his shirt as the kiss deepened. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "Marry me," Garrett said, resting his forehead against hers. "I know I don't have much to offer. This ranch is small and some years are lean. I can't promise you fancy dresses or a big house or any of the things you might have had back east. But I can promise that I'll love you for the rest of my life, that I'll work hard to provide for you, and that I'll never take for granted the gift of having you beside me." "You're offering me everything I actually want," Everett said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't need fancy dresses or a big house. I just need you. Say yes to me, and you'll see that you have everything you need too." He kissed her again, longer this time, and when they broke apart, he was smiling so broadly it transformed his entire face. "Then you have everything, Everett Thompson, because you already had my heart from the moment I saw you behind that overturned stage, brave and scared and refusing to give up." They made their way back to town as the sun was setting, and Garrett came inside to formally ask Aunt Helen's blessing. She gave it enthusiastically, tears streaming down her face as she hugged them both. "I knew it," she declared. "Didn't I tell you, Everett? When it's right, you know right away. Your parents would have been so happy for you." They decided to marry quickly, seeing no point in a long engagement. 2 weeks would give Everett time to make a simple dress, and for Garrett to prepare the ranch house for a wife. Word spread through St. George at lightning speed, and people Everett barely knew offered congratulations and help. The women of the town rallied around her, helping with the dress and bringing household goods to start her new life. Even some of the Mormon women, who might have been expected to look askance at a non-Mormon marriage, were generous with their time and gifts. It reinforced what Everett had already learned about this place, that community mattered more than differences, and good people were appreciated regardless of their background. The wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon in late October, when the brutal summer heat had finally broken and the air had turned crisp and clear. They married in the community hall rather than a church, with the justice of the peace officiating. Everett wore her simple cream-colored dress, which the boarding house seamstress had helped her embellish with delicate embroidery. Garrett wore his best suit, looking both nervous and happier than she'd ever seen him. Aunt Helen cried through the entire ceremony. Pete served as Garrett's best man, standing stiffly in clothes that looked like they'd been pulled from the back of a trunk, but cleaned and pressed for the occasion. Sheriff Montgomery gave Everett away, since she had no family besides her aunt present. The hall was packed with what seemed like half the town, all of them genuinely happy to celebrate this union. When the justice of the peace pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed her sweetly, mindful of their audience but unable to completely hide his joy. The gathered crowd cheered, and then the celebration began in earnest. There was food, so much food that the tables groaned under the weight of it, and music and dancing that went on for hours. Douglas Sutton made a brief appearance, offering stiff congratulations that fooled no one. But Everett refused to let his presence dim her happiness, and Garrett simply ignored the man entirely. Soon enough, Sutton left, clearly uncomfortable with the genuine warmth and community spirit on display. As the evening wore on, Everett found herself standing with a group of women who'd become her friends over the past weeks. They were giving her advice, some practical and some that made her blush furiously, but all of it delivered with kindness and the desire to help her navigate this new phase of life. When it was finally time to leave, Garrett helped her into the wagon, now decorated with wildflowers and ribbons tied by children from her school. They drove through the cheering crowd toward Garrett's ranch, toward their ranch, toward the beginning of their life together. The house looked different when they arrived, and Everett realized Garrett had been making changes. The interior had been freshly cleaned, wildflowers filled mason jars on every surface, and the bed in the loft had been made up with a beautiful quilt that she recognized as Aunt Helen's work. "Pete helped me get everything ready," Garrett admitted. "I wanted it to be nice for you." "It's perfect," Everett said, meaning it. "Everything is perfect." They stood in the center of the main room, and suddenly the reality of being married, of being alone together for the first time as husband and wife, made them both a little shy. "Are you nervous?" Garrett asked. "A little." "Are you?" "Terrified," he admitted with a small laugh. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and discover this was all a dream." Everett moved closer, taking his hands in hers. "It's real. We're real. And we have the rest of our lives to figure everything out together." He pulled her close, holding her like she was precious and breakable and infinitely valuable. "I love you, Everett Easton. I'm going to spend every day making sure you never regret choosing me. I could never regret this. Never." He kissed her then, deeper than before, and she responded with all the love and trust she felt. When he lifted her and carried her up to the loft, she went willingly, ready to begin this new chapter of their life together. The next morning, Everett woke to sunlight streaming through the loft window and Garrett's arm wrapped around her waist. She lay still for a moment, savoring the peace and contentment that filled her. This man, this place, this life, it was more than she'd ever dreamed of finding. Garrett stirred beside her, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. "Good morning, Mrs. Easton." "Good morning, Mr. Easton. How do you feel?" She turned in his arms to face him. "Happy. Happier than I knew it was possible to be." They spent that Sunday at the ranch, Garrett showing Everett the daily routines and rhythms of the place. She met all the horses, learning their names and personalities. There was Thunder, the chestnut gelding Garrett had ridden the day he'd rescued her. There was a pregnant mare named Daisy who was due to foal in the spring. There were several younger horses in various stages of training, and a few older ones that Garrett kept because they'd earned their retirement. Pete arrived mid-morning and pretended to be surprised to see them, though his knowing grin suggested otherwise. He'd brought fresh bread and jam from town, a gift from Aunt Helen, and stayed for coffee before making himself scarce again. In the days that followed, Everett settled into her new life with surprising ease. She continued teaching during the week, riding into town each morning and returning each afternoon. Garrett had given her the gentle mare, a pretty buckskin named Honey, as a wedding gift. He'd trained the horse specifically for her. He admitted, starting weeks before he'd even proposed, because he'd known even then that he wanted to marry her. At home, she learned the rhythms of ranch life. She'd never been afraid of hard work, and the physical labor required to maintain their household and help with the horses was demanding but satisfying. She learned to cook over a wood stove, to tend a garden, to preserve food for the winter months. Garrett was patient with her mistakes and generous with his praise for her successes. They worked together in the evenings, Garrett often doing leather work or maintaining equipment while Everett graded lessons or mended clothes. Sometimes they read aloud to each other, taking turns with whatever book had caught their interest. Other times they simply talked, sharing thoughts and dreams and the small details of their days. Life wasn't perfect. The work was hard, the isolation sometimes challenging after the bustle of Boston. Money was often tight, and there were weeks when they had to carefully count every penny. But they were happy, genuinely and deeply happy in a way that made the difficulties feel manageable. Winter arrived gradually, the days growing shorter and cooler, though nothing like the brutal cold of eastern winters. They spent Christmas quietly at the ranch, just the two of them and Pete, exchanging small gifts and sharing a meal. Everett had knitted Garrett a warm scarf, and he'd made her a beautiful wooden box for her personal treasures, with her initials carved intricately into the lid. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "You made this." "My father taught me woodworking when I was young." It's one of the few things we shared that didn't end in an argument. He looked almost shy. "I wanted you to have something that would last, something to keep things that matter to you." She kissed him tenderly. "You're what matters to me. This is just a beautiful reminder of that." Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and new growth, and with it came the birth of Daisy's foal. Everett was in town teaching when it happened, and she arrived home to find Garrett grinning like a child on Christmas morning. "Come see," he said, pulling her toward the barn. The foal was a perfect little colt, all long legs and big eyes, standing shakily next to his mother. Everett caught her breath at the beauty of it, this new life that represented hope and continuity. "He's perfect," she whispered. "He is. I thought we could name him together." They stood watching the mare and foal, throwing out names and rejecting them until Everett said, "What about Promise?" "Because he represents the promise of the future." Garrett's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Promise it is." That evening, as they were preparing for bed, Everett realized her monthly courses were late. She'd been so busy with the end of the school term and the excitement of the foal that she hadn't noticed immediately. Now, standing in their loft bedroom, she placed a hand over her stomach and wondered. "Garrett," she said carefully, "I think I might be pregnant." He froze in the act of pulling off his boots. "You think?" "I'm not certain yet, but the signs are there. How would you feel about that?" He was across the room in an instant, pulling her into his arms. "How would I feel?" "Everett, I'd be thrilled. Terrified and overwhelmed and completely unprepared, but thrilled. Are you happy about it?" "I am. I didn't expect it to happen so soon, but yes, I'm happy." They went into town the next week to see the doctor, who confirmed what Everett had suspected. She was indeed pregnant, likely about 3 months along, which meant the baby would arrive in late fall. The news spread through St. George with the same speed as everything else, and once again the community rallied around them. Women who'd given birth themselves offered advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. Aunt Helen immediately began knitting tiny blankets and booties. Even Pete, gruff as he was, seemed pleased, mentioning casually that he knew how to make a cradle if Garrett's woodworking skills weren't up to the task. As summer arrived with its intense heat, Everett had to stop teaching. The physical demands of being pregnant combined with the temperature made the ride into town too difficult. She missed her students, but the school term had ended anyway, and she promised herself she'd return in the fall once the baby was born and she'd recovered. Instead, she focused on preparing for the baby and helping Garrett with the ranch. He tried to insist she do less, worried about her overexerting herself, but Everett was healthy and strong and refused to be treated like an invalid. They compromised, with her doing lighter tasks and resting more frequently. One hot July afternoon, they were working together in the barn when a rider approached at a gallop. It was one of the hands from the Sutton ranch, and he looked panicked. "Easton, there's trouble. Mr. Sutton's men are trying to divert your creek, saying he has the rights to it. Sheriff Montgomery sent me to fetch you." Garrett's face went hard. "Pete, stay with Everett. I'll go handle this." "I'm coming with you," Everett said immediately. "Everett, you're pregnant. It's too hot, and if there's trouble, you'll need witnesses. Sutton's been waiting for an excuse to make a move, and I won't let him claim you started something you didn't. I'm coming, and that's final." Garrett knew better than to argue when she used that tone. They rode toward the creek, and as they drew closer, they could see a group of men with shovels attempting to build a dam that would divert the water away from Garrett's land. Douglas Sutton was there, directing the operation. He looked up as they arrived, a smug expression on his face. "Easton, come to accept reality. This water source has always been mine. You've just been stealing it all these years." "That's a lie, and you know it," Garrett said, dismounting. "I have the deed to this land, and it clearly includes water rights to the creek. Sheriff Montgomery has a copy on file." "Deeds can be wrong. I'm simply correcting an error." Sheriff Montgomery arrived then, along with several townspeople who'd heard about the dispute. The sheriff dismounted and studied the situation. "Douglas, what exactly are you doing, claiming what's mine, Sheriff?" "This water belongs to my land." "That's not what the county records say. I checked them myself after Garrett bought this property. The water rights are clear." "Then the records are wrong. Or you're just greedy," Everett said clearly, her voice carrying. "You've been trying to force Garrett off this land since he bought it because you can't stand that he's succeeding without your permission or help. Well, it won't work. This land is ours, the water is ours, and you have no claim to any of it." Sutton's face turned red. "You should teach your wife to keep quiet, Easton. Women shouldn't involve themselves in men's business." "My wife can speak whenever and however she likes," Garrett said evenly. "And she's right. You've been trying to steal my land for years, and I'm done being patient about it." "Sheriff, I want to press charges for attempted theft and destruction of property." The sheriff nodded. "That's your right. Douglas, I suggest you tell your men to stop digging and come with me. We'll sort this out at the office." For a moment, Sutton looked like he might refuse, but with half the town watching and the sheriff's hand resting on his gun, he finally relented. "This isn't over, Easton." "Yes, it is," Garrett replied calmly. "You lost. Accept it." As Sutton and his men rode away with the sheriff, the townspeople who'd come to witness stepped forward to congratulate Garrett on standing his ground. Several of them offered to help repair any damage Sutton's men had done, and within an hour, the attempted dam had been dismantled and the creek was flowing normally again. On the ride home, Everett noticed Garrett was shaking slightly. She reached over to take his hand. "You were amazing," she said softly. "You stood up to him without losing your temper or backing down." "I was terrified," he admitted. Not of him, but of losing this place, of failing you and our baby. This land, this life, it's everything to me. You didn't fail. You'll never fail us. And Sutton won't bother us again. He's lost face in front of the whole town. She was right. The confrontation had lasting consequences, though not the ones Sutton had intended. Word spread throughout the area about his attempted theft, and his reputation suffered considerably. Several business associates distanced themselves from him, and 2 of his best ranch hands quit, disgusted by his tactics. One of them, a young man named Tom, came to ask Garrett for work. Garrett hired him immediately, grateful for the extra help with the ranch expanding. Tom proved to be a hard worker and got along well with Pete, and having another hand meant Garrett could spend more time preparing for the baby's arrival. He built the cradle himself, despite Pete's offer, working on it in the evenings by lamplight. It was a beautiful piece, smooth and sturdy with protective rails. He carved a tiny horse into the headboard, a symbol of the life they were building together. As Everett's due date approached, Garrett became increasingly protective. He insisted on riding into town with her for her checkups with the doctor, worried about something happening when he wasn't there. Everett found his concern touching even when it bordered on excessive. The baby came on a cool November evening, earlier than expected but not dangerously so. Garrett rode like mad to fetch the midwife while Aunt Helen, who'd been visiting, stayed with Everett. By the time he returned, Everett was deep into labor, and he paced outside the bedroom like a caged animal until Aunt Helen finally told him to come inside and be useful. "Hold her hand," she ordered. "Talk to her. Help her through this." Garrett did, whispering encouragement and love while Everett gripped his hand hard enough to leave marks. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when fear gripped Garrett's heart, but finally, as dawn was breaking, their son was born. The baby's first cry was the most beautiful sound Garrett had ever heard. The midwife cleaned and wrapped the infant, then placed him in Everett's arms. She looked exhausted but radiant, tears streaming down her face as she gazed at their child. "He's perfect," she whispered. "Look at him, Garrett. We made this person." Garrett sat on the edge of the bed, his own eyes wet, and carefully touched his son's tiny hand. The baby's fingers wrapped around his, and Garrett felt his heart expand in a way he'd never experienced before. "What should we name him?" Everett asked. They'd discussed names for months without deciding. But looking at his son now, holding both of them in the golden light of early morning, Garrett knew. "Grant, after your father, he should carry that legacy, carry forward the good man your father was." Everett's tears came harder. "Are you sure?" "I thought you'd want to name him after your mother's family. Your father raised an incredible woman. Our son should be lucky enough to share his name." He kissed her forehead gently. "Garrett Easton. It suits him." Baby Grant proved to be a good-natured infant, crying when he was hungry or wet, but otherwise content to observe the world with serious dark eyes. Everett recovered well from the birth, and within a few weeks, she was back to her normal routines, though now with a baby strapped to her back in a carrier Tom's Paiute wife had shown her how to make. The first year of Grant's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and small miracles. His first smile, his first laugh, the first time he rolled over each milestone felt monumental. Garrett proved to be a devoted father, taking his turn walking Grant when he was fussy, changing diapers without complaint, and singing off key lullabies that never failed to soothe the baby. The ranch continued to thrive. Word of Garrett's skill with horses spread, and people came from increasingly distant places to buy his animals or have him train theirs. Money was less tight, though they remained careful, saving what they could against future difficulties. When Grant was 18 months old, Everett discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their daughter was born on a warm May evening, arriving so quickly that the midwife almost didn't make it in time. They named her Hope, because she represented the hope they held for the future. Life settled into new rhythms with 2 children. Grant was a serious, thoughtful boy who loved following his father around and helping with the horses. Hope was more spirited, quick to laugh and fearless in a way that terrified Garrett and made Everett laugh. Together, they filled the ranch house with noise and love and the controlled chaos that comes with young children. Everett eventually returned to teaching part-time, with Aunt Helen watching the children. She loved being back in the classroom, though she was equally happy to return home each day to her family. The balance felt right, allowing her to pursue work she found meaningful while still being present for Grant and Hope. The years passed in this way, each season bringing its own challenges and joys. Grant learned to ride almost before he could walk, showing the same natural affinity for horses his father possessed. Hope proved to have her mother's quick mind and her father's stubbornness, a combination that promised both great things and considerable trouble as she grew. Pete became an unofficial grandfather to the children, teaching Grant to whittle, and letting Hope help with ranch chores while telling her stories that were at least 70% exaggeration. Tom's family grew too, and the children played together, learning early that friendship transcended any cultural differences. Douglas Sutton remained a presence in the area, but he'd learned his lesson. He kept his distance from the Eastons, focusing on his own affairs. Occasionally, Garrett and Everett would see him in town, and they'd exchange curt nods. The animosity faded to mutual disregard. 5 years after they'd married, on a cool October evening much like the day of their wedding, Garrett and Everett stood on their porch watching the sunset while their children played in the yard. Grant was teaching Hope how to throw a rope, though at 3 years old she mostly ended up tangling herself in it. "You ever miss Boston?" Garrett asked, his arm around Everett's shoulders. She leaned into him, breathing in the sage-scented air. "No, there's nothing there for me now. Everything I love, everything that matters is right here. No regrets. I know this life is hard sometimes, that there are things you gave up to be here." Everett turned to face him fully. "The only things I gave up were things that didn't matter. You gave me everything that does: love, purpose, family, belonging. What more could I possibly want?" He pulled her close, kissing her with the same tenderness and passion he'd shown on their wedding night. "I promised you the world once, remember? Back when I was trying to court you properly and stumbling over my words. I remember, and I told you I just wanted you. And I said then you'd have everything. You were right." She smiled up at him, her eyes bright with love. "You were absolutely right." They stood together watching their children play, their ranch stretching around them, the life they'd built together solid and real and more fulfilling than either had dreamed possible. The wild Utah desert had tested them, shaped them, and given them a home. They'd faced danger, confronted challenges, and emerged stronger for it. Years continued to flow by like the creek that ran through their property, sometimes rushing fast with change, sometimes slow and peaceful, but always moving forward. Grant grew into a young man with his father's steady nature and his mother's insight, taking on more responsibility at the ranch until it became as much his as Garrett's. He showed the same gift for horses his father possessed, and together they built the ranch into one of the most respected breeding operations in southern Utah. Hope proved to be equally talented, but in different ways. She had her mother's love of learning and became the first person in either family to attend university, studying agriculture at the new land-grant college. She returned home with modern ideas about animal husbandry and land management, that she implemented alongside her father and brother's traditional methods. The combination of old and new making the ranch even more successful. Both children married good people who loved them and understood the rhythm of ranch life. Grant married a rancher's daughter from Cedar City, a capable woman named Sarah who'd grown up in the saddle and knew the work as well as he did. Hope married a veterinarian named James who'd come west from Pennsylvania, drawn by the opportunity to work with the livestock operations that dominated the territory. Everett and Garrett became grandparents to 7 children, in total 4 from Grant and Sarah, 3 from Hope and James. The ranch house was expanded to accommodate family gatherings, and holidays became loud, chaotic affairs filled with children's laughter and the comfortable conversation of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Pete lived to see all the grandchildren born, finally passing peacefully in his sleep at the age of 81. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, and Garrett carved a headstone with his own hands, honoring the man who'd been friend, mentor, and family. Tom stayed on at the ranch until his own children were grown, then retired to a small place of his own nearby. His son eventually took his position, continuing the family connection to the Eastons into the next generation. Aunt Helen remained a vital presence in their lives, her boarding house continuing to serve as a hub of St. George's community life. She finally retired at 75, moving into a cottage near the ranch where she could be close to Everett and the grandchildren. She passed away at 83, surrounded by the family she'd helped create, content in the knowledge that the niece she'd welcomed as an orphan had built a beautiful life. St. George itself grew and changed over the decades. The tabernacle was completed, a magnificent building that became the heart of the community. The railroad arrived, connecting the isolated settlement to the wider world. Electric lights replaced oil lamps, automobiles began to appear alongside horses, and the rough frontier town gradually transformed into an established city. Through it all, the Easton Ranch remained, a testament to hard work, careful stewardship, and the power of family. The horses they bred became known throughout the Southwest for their quality, stamina, and temperament. Multiple generations of ranchers and cowboys rode Easton horses, trusting them with their lives in the unforgiving desert landscape. Garrett and Everett watched it all from the porch of their ranch house, that same porch where they'd shared so many evenings over the years. They'd grown older together, their hair turning gray, their faces weathering like the landscape around them. But their love had only deepened with time, each year adding layers of shared experience and understanding. On their 50th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered to celebrate. The youngest grandchild, a serious 6-year-old named after Everett, asked her grandmother to tell the story of how she and Grandpa Garrett had met. Everett settled into her rocking chair, Garrett beside her with his hand in hers, and began the tale that had become family legend. She told about the overturned stagecoach and the outlaws, about the cowboy who'd ridden to her rescue, about falling in love in the harsh beauty of the Utah desert. And then Grandpa proposed, she said, smiling at the memory. He told me he couldn't promise me much, that life would be hard and money tight and the work never ending. He said he wished he could promise me the world. What did you say? Young Everett asked, enthralled. I told him I didn't want the world, I just wanted him. And what did Grandpa say? Garrett squeezed Everett's hand, speaking for the first time. I told her that if she wanted just me, then she had everything, because loving her and being loved by her was more wealth than any man deserved. And you were right, Everett said softly, meeting his eyes. You've given me everything that matters: love, family, purpose, home. Everything I could have ever wanted, you gave me. Their grandchildren absorbed this, the older ones understanding more than the younger ones, but all sensing the weight of truth in their grandparents' words. As the celebration continued around them, Garrett and Everett sat together, content in the life they'd built. That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, they sat on their porch one more time, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. 50 years, Everett mused. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you came riding up to that overturned stage. Other times it feels like we've been together forever. Both are true, I think, Garrett replied. The love was instant, but the life took time to build. No regrets, not a single one. You. Only that we don't have another 50 years ahead of us, Garrett chuckled. We've been blessed with what we've had, more than blessed. I never imagined I'd have a life like this, a woman I love beyond measure, children and grandchildren who are good people doing good things, work that matters, land that provides. It's more than I ever dreamed possible. Me too. Everett leaned against his shoulder, still finding the same comfort there she'd found on that first ride into St. George so many years ago. When I left Boston, I thought I was running away from loss and pain. I never imagined I was actually running toward everything I'd ever wanted. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from decades of companionship. The creek burbled in the distance, the same creek Garrett had protected so fiercely all those years ago. Horses shifted in the barn, descendants of the animals he'd trained when they'd first married. In the house behind them, the cradle he'd carved for Grant, used for all their children and grandchildren, sat in a place of honor, waiting for the next generation. The desert night wrapped around them, cool and vast and familiar. Somewhere out in that darkness, a coyote called and another answered. The sound had frightened Everett when she'd first arrived, but now it was simply part of home, as natural as breathing. I love you, Everett Easton, Garrett said quietly. Have since the moment I saw you, will until I draw my last breath. I love you too, Garrett Easton. You saved my life that day in more ways than one. You gave me a reason to live, to hope, to build something beautiful out of loss. He kissed her softly, gently, with 50 years of tenderness behind it. They rose and went inside together, arms around each other, still finding strength and comfort in each other's presence, just as they had from the very beginning. The years that followed were quieter but no less rich. Garrett and Everett gradually handed more of the ranch operations to Grant and his family, though they remained involved and active. They traveled some, taking the train to see parts of the country they'd never visited, but they always returned home to their beloved ranch with relief and joy. They celebrated more anniversaries, more birthdays, more milestones. They held new great-grandchildren and watched their grandchildren grow into fine adults. They saw Hope's children become the first in the family to leave ranching entirely, pursuing careers in medicine and teaching and business. They saw Grant's children carry on the ranch traditions, ensuring the Easton name would continue to be associated with quality horses and ethical practices. When Garrett was 78, he fell ill suddenly, his heart giving him trouble. The doctor said it was remarkable he'd lasted this long given the physical demands of ranch life. But Garrett just laughed and said good living, and a better wife had kept him going. He recovered from that scare, but it served as a reminder that their time was finite. They made a point of saying the important things more often, of telling their children and grandchildren exactly how much they were loved, of ensuring the family understood the values that had guided them all these years. Hard work, honest dealing, and taking care of each other, Garrett told his assembled family one Sunday dinner. That's what built this place, and that's what will keep it going. But most important is love for the land, love for the work, and love for each other. Without that, All the rest means nothing." Everett added, "Your grandfather and I started with almost nothing but our love for each other. Everything else grew from that. Don't ever forget that wealth isn't measured in money or possessions, but in relationships and the life you build together." Their family took these words to heart, living by them and passing them down to their own children. Garrett passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, with Everett beside him holding his hand. His last words were, "I love you," whispered to the woman who'd been his partner, his love, and his best friend for more than 55 years. The funeral was enormous, with people coming from throughout Utah and beyond to pay their respects. Garrett had touched countless lives through his integrity, his skill, and his kindness. The church was packed, and they had to set up chairs outside for all the people who came to say goodbye. Everett bore her grief with the same quiet strength she'd shown throughout her life, though those close to her could see the profound loss in her eyes. She remained at the ranch, surrounded by family, finding comfort in the familiar routines and the presence of children and grandchildren who loved her. She lived 4 more years, staying active and engaged with ranch life until the very end. She continued to read voraciously, to tend her garden, to tell stories to her great-grandchildren about the cowboy who'd saved her life and stolen her heart. On a cool October evening, very much like the one when she'd first arrived in St. George all those decades ago, Everett passed away quietly in her sleep. She was 86 years old and had lived a life rich in love and meaning. They buried her next to Garrett on the hill overlooking the ranch, their headstones side by side facing the red rock cliffs and vast desert sky they'd loved so much. The inscription on Everett's stone, chosen by her children, reads simply, "She wanted only love and found she had everything." The ranch continued under Grant's management, and then his children's, each generation adding their own touch while honoring the foundation Garrett and Everett had laid. The Easton name remained synonymous with quality and integrity, a living legacy to the couple who'd built it all from love and determination. The story of how they met became family legend, told and retold at gatherings, each generation finding inspiration in their ancestors' courage and commitment. The old house was carefully maintained, with the original furniture and personal items preserved as family treasures. The cradle Garrett had carved held a place of honor, still used for each new baby born into the family. The creek still flowed through the property, life-giving and constant. The corral still held horses bearing the distinctive characteristics of Easton breeding. The porch where Garrett and Everett had spent so many evenings still offered views of the spectacular desert landscape. And on quiet evenings, family members who sat on that porch and watched the sunset paint the cliffs in shades of red and gold sometimes felt the presence of those who'd come before. It was as if Garrett and Everett's love had soaked into the very land, blessing it and everyone who came after them. Their great-grandchildren grew up hearing the stories, understanding that they came from people who'd faced danger and hardship and emerged stronger for it. They learned that true wealth had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with love and family, and the courage to build something meaningful. They carried forward the values their ancestors had lived by, ensuring that Garrett and Everett's legacy extended far beyond the physical ranch. The cowboy who'd ridden to save a frightened young woman behind an overturned stagecoach could never have imagined the impact of that single choice. But in saving Everett's life that hot August afternoon, he'd set in motion a love story that would echo through generations, inspiring countless others to choose courage, to value integrity, and above all, to recognize that love, true, genuine, committed love, was indeed everything that mattered. And so the story of Garrett and Everett Easton became more than just a tale told around the dinner table. It became a guiding principle, a foundation on which an entire family built their lives. It was proof that sometimes, in the most unexpected moments and the most unlikely places, two people could find each other and create something beautiful that would last far beyond their own lifetimes. The wild Utah desert that had brought them together continued to shape their descendants, teaching each generation resilience, appreciation for beauty, and the understanding that sometimes the harshest landscapes produce the strongest roots. The Red Cliffs stood eternal witness to the passage of time, unchanging while families grew and evolved beneath their ancient gaze. In the small cemetery on the hill, Garrett and Everett rested side by side, their story complete. They'd started with nothing but courage and love, and they'd built everything that mattered. He'd promised her the world, she'd said she just wanted him, and he'd told her she had everything. In the end, they'd both been right. Love had been everything, and everything had been enough.